And welcome back. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that plans to expropriate land without compensation would be a disaster for South Africa's economy and South Africa's people. Now, speaking in Addis Ababa yesterday, Pompeo said that the policy proposal is an example of centralized planning that's failed in other countries such as Zimbabwe, Tanzania and Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Parliament's Land Committee is holding public hearings for submissions on legislation that will amend Section 25 of the Constitution to include a clause to allow for land expropriation without compensation. Economic consultant Dr Peter Karungu and Ernst van Zyl, AfriForum's campaign officer, join us for this discussion. Mr. van Zyl is here, but Dr Karungu, I'm going to start with you. So, firstly, should we be concerned that the United States is, at this point, making these pronouncements?
I would be concerned because the Secretary of the United States, to say the failed state are Ethiopia and Tanzania, that's not true. On the contrary, we can prove the opposite. First and foremost, if you look at the development and the growth in Ethiopia of 11%, 9% on average the last 10 years, is emanating from small-scale farming, coffee farming. So sometimes the pronouncement of these numbers and the figures are shocking to economists because when you throw them without facts, that scares me, number one. Number two, let's understand the following. The greatest concern South Africa needs to address is the following. How long can we sustain unemployment of 39%? How long can we have the level of hopelessness? How long can we sustain a situation in which literally 20% sit on 80% of the wealth? We got to start thinking what is today short, medium and long term. For our children, we need to address the issues of unemployment, inequality, helplessness. First and foremost, apartheid was a crime against humanity of untold proportion. The most it did, the worst, in my view as an economist, is to deny masses access to good education, analytical skills that has led us to where we are. Number two, it is forceful eviction of moving people from natural resources that are God-given and taken to live under squalor condition. Even today, the threat of South Africa is not necessarily diseases. It's this inequality that was man-made, that was put together by a system that we try not to address because we fear we hurt those who are privileged. And that's a major concern.
Ernst van Zyl, Mike Pompeo's concerns, are they valid?
Yes, I think it's well, AfriForum welcomes the comments and the concerns. I think really this is an important conversation to be had. As AfriForum said, with our World Must Know campaign now, we want the world to be watching South Africa to make sure that the South African politicians know that if they were to violate anyone's rights or even property rights, that the world will be taking notice and that it's not just a cowboy open season in South Africa to be taking land or to not be responsible in terms of our economic policies. And that's why AfriForum, for example, published an investor's guide also this year, just this week, that said that we want international investors to know that here's the information about what can happen in South Africa, and we want international investors to push back against destructive economic policies. Because at the end of the day, this is about the entire economy that affects every single South African. And if we let politics or populist rhetoric take over and not be responsible with our economic policies, then we are on a very dangerous road indeed.
So share with us what you shared with those international investors. What is it that they should be on the lookout for?
Well, I wasn't one of the authors of the report, but for example, we are basically, to give it in a simple manner, we gave them information in terms of, they should be, it's not information in terms of how to, AfriForum doesn't want people to divest from South Africa. We just want them to be aware that South Africa has politicians that are currently threatening their investments, and that we give them the information to empower them to be able to like Secretary Pompeo now, in a similar manner, push back against it and say, but we do not want, for example, our investments expropriated in your country.
But how would they be expropriated? How are investments being threatened by the proposed amendment?
Well, by destructive economic policies. If we, for example, take a reckless approach to land, or for example to expropriation, that will be pretty much lead to the collapse of the economy like we saw in Zimbabwe, and that would mean that these investors lose everything that they have in South Africa. So I think it's only fair that they are aware of the dangers that lurk within populist rhetoric that we're seeing in South Africa.
I think I have tremendous respect for AfriForum in terms of intellectual, but what they say and the hype they give cannot be supported by economic facts. Let me give you some facts. South Africa is endowed with the most resources worldwide. It's the most industrial country in Africa. It has the highest unemployment rate in Africa. Kenya, unemployment rate is between 12 and 9%. In a country like Ghana, it's 6.8%. In a clip like Nigeria, with 200 million people, is 23%. In our country, it's unspeakable. Because we don't want to address the challenges we face. You can talk about investors from anywhere, but if you don't understand the underlying problem we face, that are structural, economic structure problem, based on the fact, like I said, you evicted people from a natural resource, relocated them to squatter condition without giving them even education. You can't address that in Parliament. It has to be AfriForum and us economists and you and I to start saying, one, in the event we don't address these things now, the future of our children and grandchildren is that bleak. We need to stop thinking short term, like I hear from my colleague. We need to think short, medium and long term. And ask, is this sustainable? Whereby, in my view, the picture we see as you drive from anywhere from Joburg for 300 kilometers is vast pieces of land with the squatter huts around. And somewhere inside in a kilometer, you see a big home, a mansion. The land times is not used. Nobody says we can make reckless decisions. Parliament is honored to be respected. We also see the fracas in Parliament, in Congress, in United States. We are seeing even the speaker tearing papers. We watch that. We are saying the world has reached a point whereby rationality needs to be guided by fair play, pragmatic solutions. AfriForum knows it's not sustainable to have the privileged 20% without considering the poorest of the poor who are the majority. I'll give you a good example. If you go to meetings in Stellenbosch, where I go to discuss business with people, whatever, you get to be told, I quote, in Stellenbosch, you are told, listen, if the product we have here is not recommended by Switzerland system, we can't sell it in South Africa. That's the mentality we need to change. Not to talk about the Secretary of State, who himself does not know the fastest growing economy in Africa is Ethiopia, the fastest growing economy in Africa is Tanzania, and pump them as failed state. That doesn't make sense. He needs to understand that this is where the growth is. But more important, like I said, give those who are at the given, the poor farmers. The logic I hear from AfriForum is that if we let them farm, they cannot produce, we can only do commercial farming. That is not true, because history tells you, if you go read, when Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, after independence, the theory was only commercial farm can do coffee, only commercial farm can do cotton, only commercial farm can do sisal, only commercial farm can do tea. But it changed. People are given 30 acres, 50 acres. We tripled production. Today, most of the fastest growing economy is where they are driven by small-scale farmers. If, and AfriForum needs to test this, if today we give land to the majority of the poor, we give them the input, we can turn around unemployment in this country by 10% in 5 years. That's common call. It's for you and I to benefit. It's not for us to defend the impossible, knowing it's not sustainable. But more important, and this is where we need to be able to change, I keep on hearing, try to imagine, all the farms in this country, the mechanical drivers are black drivers. The people planting, the people who are weeding. Give them 50 hectares and tell them this is your land. We're going to win 100%. Finally, the most supported system worldwide is agriculture support system in the US and the France or the European Union. They spend trillion to support farmers. In the United States in 1990, when I was a student, they were spending 280 billion to support farmers, to make sure the farmers and the people in the urban rural areas live at a better lifestyle. We are saying, let's do the same. But we are told by people who know better, my colleagues here, that we can't do it. So what are we, as I'm proposing? In my view, in the long term, they are saying, as long as we don't do it now, let our children have nothing, because it will have inevitably to change. For one principle, look, if we argue democracy is one man, one vote, and the people with very little, the people who are helpless, the people who are evicted, become the majority, they'll vote you out. It doesn't matter what you say. Are they going to take over? It is going to be a disaster we are looking at. I want Afri Forum to start pragmatic thinking, economic thinking, that is long-term, not opportunistic, not what somebody says. What somebody says has no relevance to South Africa, because South Africa is facing dire situation of high crime, high people uneducated, a lot of people who don't have jobs, and we need to address it.
Mr. van Zyl?
Right, well, no, very interesting information there. Actually, agree with some of it in terms of, well, I like the fact that you mentioned some case studies in Africa, especially Ethiopia. A lot of, if you go look at their economy at the moment, a lot of their growth is coming from trade liberalization, through protecting property rights, incentivizing entrepreneurs to start businesses and liberalizing their economy, and not, as Secretary Pompeo said, state centralized socialism, basically, where you just put more and more power in the state's hands and it doesn't really benefit the people at all. He's warning against situations where, seeing as we are comparing current case studies in the world, he's warning against cases like Venezuela, where they did land expropriation and it failed horribly, where they did it in Zimbabwe, where you are seeing now, I think they're expecting now in the first quarter, Zimbabwean industry to shrink by 37% this year. That is a catastrophe for the poor in that country. And you want to bring that to South Africa. That's why AfriForum is saying we need good dialogue, and we need to talk about sound economic policy. And for example, when you talk, you cannot deny the past. You cannot deny that there were wrongs committed in the past, and that there needs to be in the present need to work towards a more equitable society. I think that's a pretty good stance to take. But then you also need to remember that I'm glad that my colleague here mentioned there's this big conversation at the moment about crime against humanity, or that type of idea in South Africa. And what I find interesting is, in that UN declaration declaring apartheid a crime against humanity, they also declare expropriation of land from targeting a racial group for land expropriation as a crime against humanity. So we can't solve the problems of the past, or the wrongs of the past, by committing crimes against humanity in the present. It's a very bizarre idea for me. So if
how
you
do
look,
you explain that? Because the fact of the matter, as you acknowledge yourself, is that there was a crime perpetrated. There has to be redress for that crime that was perpetrated. How do you suggest the redress happens? Because Secretary Pompeo is oblivious to the fact that we've had a willing buyer, willing seller policy in this country since our democratic dispensation that hasn't worked. It hasn't seen the desired results. Hence, we are now at a point where people are looking for alternatives. Say, how else can we address this land question such that it actually gives you the desired results?
No, exactly. I think that's a very good question, because I think that is the big question, or the big debate, or the crux of the debate that we're having in this country at the moment. How do we solve the immense problems that we have without becoming the monsters of the past that we so condemn or talk against? Because that's the big thing. The big threat that you have is that when you are so committed to righting the wrongs of the past, you then resort to means that are unjust in themselves, because the ends cannot justify the means, because the means that you employ influence the ends that you produce. And In AfriForum's case, we think that there are lots of African countries that we can learn from. Botswana is a very good example. Botswana has a very strong commitment to property rights, protecting property rights, and to an economy that encourages entrepreneurship and business. I mean, what Secretary Pompeo here says when he talks about the centralized state threatening economic growth and being a disaster, we saw this just a few weeks in Johannesburg, where there was a man who sold sandwiches next to the road, and just to send his daughter to school. And this man, he comes from a poor background, and he uplifted himself all by himself with no assistance from the state. And he was earning 20,000 Rand a month through his own business that he started.
Objective reality, though, is that we have a system in South Africa where that Section 25 of the Constitution has not been amended, and already we are seeing these catastrophic economic situations play out in our country.
But just to finish that thought,
2017, a report by government states that at that point, 72% of commercial farms in this country were still in white hands. That is the reality that we are dealing with.
Right, but he also talked, it's very quickly, and I'll let my colleagues speak. It's just, and this man in Johannesburg that was selling sandwiches, the government stepped in and they took his stock. The police took it because he didn't have a license, or he had some type of discrepancy or error on his license. That is what Secretary Pompeo is warning against, that type of state encroachment where the state is trying to micromanage prosperity rather than letting the market do itself, and let people like him be examples to South Africans that you can do it without state assistance or giving the state more power.
Dr. Karungu, and as you respond, because let's also not forget that AfriForum has been on some sort of charm offensive to countries like the United States, where they have been spreading this message, highlighting their fears, as it were, about this coming situation.
A very great concern, because in the sense that I keep on saying, it's in the interest of the privileged to protect the long-term future of their interest. In other words, the tenure of all the farmers, of all AfriForum members, of all of us, is tied to the situation of the poverty in the country. If you don't address these issues, the threat is not more to the black community, it's more to you guys. Because it will happen, that is inevitable, that the majority cannot subject to the pain of helplessness, which was emanating from a situation they didn't have power over. That's why you see a lot of tension in the country. I answer that. I get worried when people give the worst case scenario to justify what somebody said. When I keep on hearing about Zimbabwe, the case of Sandwich, I get worried. Let me tell you why. Zimbabwe's scenario ought to be in AfriForum, if they were genuine, to say the result of what we saw in Zimbabwe was to delay accessing of land by the majority. Instead of addressing the issue in 1980, they waited for more than 20 years to try to do it. It became literally impossible. So you are right. If we don't do it, it could be chaotic going forward. I package. However, look at it this way. In economic, there are four natural resources that drive the economy. We start by land. Land is a natural resource. It's given by nature to us. Each one of us has a right, because you cannot be born to live up in the sky. The second one is labor. Are the concerns
valid in terms of that disposition that AfriForum is envisaging? You know, when we talk about expropriation of land without compensation, should we acknowledge their concerns as valid?
The concern is valid because, in my view, with respect, they are opportunistic. I remember there was a commission headed by Judge Bam. I used to work with him. They were supposed to allow free seller, willing buyer. It was tried left, right, center. We are where we are because nobody did. That's a package. Number two, the government is also saying, we would rather not do it. We're going to do it when we are forced to, because it's inevitable that we have to give opportunity for the majority in order to create jobs. It's nobody, I don't hear the government saying we are going to take land by force. They are saying we're going to move that way because all else has failed. appeal to you guys.
But why has it failed? And what sort of culpability does government have to accept in this regard as well? And I'm going to park you. We'll come back to that. If you both would still stay with us, we're going to take the news and then come back to this discussion with Ernst van Zyl and Professor Karungu. But right now, 8 o'clock news with Leanne. And welcome back. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made a comment saying that plans to expropriate land without compensation would be a disaster for South Africa's economy and for the people of South Africa. And that was, of course, in Addis Ababa yesterday, where Pompeo said that policy proposal, this one, is an example of centralized planning that's failed in other countries such as Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. And I'm in conversation with Ernst van Zyl, AfriForum's campaign officer, and Dr. Peter Karungu, who is an economic consultant. So just picking up where we left off, and I was asking about the efforts of the South African government to date, Dr. Karungu. Have they done enough? I mean, the willing buyer, willing seller model has obviously failed, given the slow levels of transformation in that regard. Has the government done enough, or have they perhaps bent over too far backward in this regard?
They have not done enough because they operate within a constitutional framework. To change the constitution is not as easy. It's something you think short, medium, long term. They did try as much as they could. Unfortunately, like you said, willing buyer, willing seller didn't work. So where are we? We are in a situation in which if we got to address unemployment, the best way to do it fastest and faster than anything else is to allocate enough pieces of land for productivity by the majority who have the potential to do it, but they are never given an opportunity. That we can't disagree. How do we do it? Pompeo is not saying he doesn't give credit to the fact that nothing has not been tried. Neither, as the president says, our president is saying, it's not going to be done in any violent manner. It's going to be done in a systematic way whereby the land that you may not be using and you have not used. I know some good farmers, friends of mine, who somewhere live in near De Villiers with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hectares. They use some, they don't use some. Don't tell them take it by force, but they should be persuaded. If they don't, unfortunately, the prime right is the constitution. That will guide us, including the parliamentarian, even AfriForum who guide us. So eventually, the government did their share, but they have not done enough. Now they need to fast track faster to avoid the dire consequences of the unemployment levels and the crime we face.
Ernest, does AfriForum agree that the willing buyer, willing seller model failed? And why did it fail from your perspective? Why was there not greater success and greater redress through that model?
Well, I think something that we firstly need to look at in terms of failure and success is the failure of government to really redistribute the land that they did acquire. For example, here's some facts. For 90% of the land that they redistributed to people that weren't farmers, that people that were connected to the party or people that had the right connections, and that land lies fallow now. You also had, for example, the majority of people that received that land, 90% of them took financial compensation rather than the land itself. So there's no progress made there in terms of having a more equal distribution of land because the people took financial incentives. So now the government is still sitting with that land that they haven't redistributed. And I think that's where the crux of it is that what the government has done up until now has been woefully inefficient and ineffective in terms of really solving the problem. And I think this is what Pompeo is warning against when he says that state centralization is the problem. You can't have the government, I mean, this is the government that is in charge of ESCOM, of the post office, in charge of the public hospitals where we get all these scandals from, and you want to give them this very important job of land and equitably distributing that land, the government of state capture it, really.
So what are you suggesting? If not the government, who then should be in charge of the redistribution process?
I think we should be giving the markets and the communities this responsibility, where you can incentivize. I'm not saying government should not be involved at all, but they can incentivize people to take it into their own hands. Where we already have examples where farmers are educating people in terms of how to farm, but it's a long process. It's not something that happens overnight. And we have cases where pieces of land have been given to landless people and they've been assisted by the community of farmers in their area. And you can incentivize that if you are the government. But at the end of the day, the only way to really, truly effectively do it is to have a minimal government intervention there and leave it up to communities to solve it. And to pressure government in terms of to take accountability that they have horribly failed in their attempts so far, and that they cannot just then through populist rhetoric wish away the fact that they've failed. This is a phenomenon we see in many other countries as well. There's actually been a term coined for it so many times we've seen it. It's called land populism, where you've seen in the Ivory Coast, you've seen it now recently in Namibia, and you saw it in Zimbabwe, where as soon as a party starts losing support, they go for the land issue as a way of riling up voters. But for example, why has land become this passionate of a topic 25 years after 1994? Shouldn't it have been a constant debate that we should have first things solved as soon as we got our new democracy in the 90s?
It was always, the land was always a very emotive question. The establishment of parties like the ANC, like the PAC, all were premised on the question of the land and getting the land back. So this is not a question of 25 years ago.
No, but at the same time, you also see as soon as the ANC starts losing support, they bring the conversation more to the fore. And you see it much more commonly debated and discussed in Parliament and on television and everywhere since the ANC their support started wavering. And you see this happening in Namibia, you saw it in Zimbabwe, you saw it in Ivory Coast, now you're seeing it here. It's a pattern.
I think I can understand that you did politics. I thought the debate today is pragmatic issues on what need to be done in lieu of either the need to or not to do it, because that's my understanding. We can blame the government, and it would be unfortunate for us to address the issues of the failure of the government, given at least we have a new government. I can understand the issue you raised about the corruption, the issue, but that is, I believe, is past. And we give judiciary time to spend on that.
It's not a new government, Professor Karungu. Let's just get that right. The ANC has been the ruling party, the majority party in government. So it may be different ANC administrations, but
correct. It's the same government, but a different leadership. So I hope we are seeing something positive. And there was a hype of positive business confidence as we are watching things happening, particularly within the judiciary. I'm not a politician, I'm an economist. Let me go to the economic issue. The fact of the matter is, like we keep on asking the question is, when should it have been done? When will it be done, or will it be done? The answer is it must be done. How it will be done, that's another question. Because, like I said, it's not sustainable. The democracy we have, no matter what we say, will be guided by how many people we bring into the economy. It will be guided by how many people access land, and I quote land. Earlier on I said, there are 4 factors of production in the world. Land by order of number 1, 2, labor, 3, capital, and the other one is entrepreneurship. This one, if you don't allocate it appropriately, everything will not work very well. And that's where South Africa is. We need to start asking the question, how did we get where we are? We go back to the history. We don't want to go to apartheid history. We are where we are because land was misappropriated so bad. And it will take us maybe 100 years to correct it. So don't ask why it was not done 25 years ago. Remember, apartheid was there for 350 years.
But the land dispossession question predates the apartheid system.
Agreed. But then it was implemented effectively. Remember, there was one way, when you start now forcibly evicting people and allocating people to those who were in the good book of the system, whether they paid or not, that's not the issue. The issue is, if you don't understand how land is appropriated anywhere in the world, you're going to destroy the economy going forward. You're going to destroy the democracy. I repeat, in a political context. The democracy you are referring to, the liberal economic aspiration we want us to have, will be guided by that land issue. Remember what I said, that this you can check in any book. Check the history of the United States, check the history of Germany. You're going to hear land was the driving force. That I'm saying, for the sake of this country, in the long term, for the sake of creating jobs, for the sake of us being seen, the country that you want to see. Not the country when I gave you an example, You drive, you fly over, you see peripheral of shacks around the cities. The peripheral of Cape Town is nothing but shack from the airport you go. You and I need to address that for our children. I keep on asking somebody, what do you mean when you have a home, your home, my home? I keep on asking that question. I have a dog. I have a fence, high wall. I have a remote control. I may have a weapon in the house. You name it. It is literally coming from what we have inherited in lieu of apartheid. So let's go back to the fact Mandela and the ANC, including the NP those days, brought us to negotiate and work. But we failed to negotiate the economic imperative for the security of the democracy that we have. And that's where the discussion should be. And we can open it as academic, we can open it as a free forum, including anybody who wants to be part of it. And we can come to a solution which will mandate that if we release this land, 40% of the issue or we are addressing on poverty crime will be resolved in less than 10 years.
So what is the solution? What is AfriForum's solution to addressing the land question in South Africa?
Well, I think firstly, something my colleague mentioned that I think is very important. We talks about dialogue and we need to sort this out domestically rather than internationally. That's something we've also heard a lot now that we are busy with our campaign in the United States. But what people don't understand, we've tried for dialogue. We wrote an open letter to President Ramaphosa for dialogue and we got no response. We wrote a letter to Parliament 1 year ago, more than a year ago, asking can we talk about this issue in Parliament. They said they'd get back to us, they haven't yet. And we've written countless other letters in the past as well. We don't get any response from the government when we want to have dialogue, and then we say, well, then we go to plan B and we'll talk to people that might want to listen, and then the government really wants to talk.
But how's that going to work for you? Because ultimately that decision will be made by this government, one. But two, I'm still waiting to hear the solution from AfriForum's perspective. How do you suggest we settle this question?
Well, we settle the question by not going down the worst possible route, and that is the route, of, for example, that we saw in Zimbabwe, or the route that Mr. Pompeo is warning against. We are not saying that we have all the answers, but we know we have a pretty strong idea of what path not to go down. And that's definitely the path that we're seeing right next to us.
But surely that's short-sighted. You can't say, we know we don't want this, but beyond that, we're not really thinking about how to bring about the solution.
No, but that's like saying when you have a wound on your arm, saying, well, I don't know exactly how to fix it, but I'm not going to chop off my arm for the guy that's saying I have to do that. Just because we know we don't have exactly the perfect answer for how we're going to solve the problem doesn't mean we can see what we shouldn't do. That's the first step that we need to identify is, okay, if we need to identify a way to solve the problem, let's make sure by looking at the case studies around us, what paths can we cut off and say, no, that's definitely not the path we should go down.
If you're traveling the world and you're trying to make this case for people to be sympathetic towards your cause, what are you saying to them? What sort of concessions are you willing to make in order to bring about redress as AfriForum?
Well, for us, the big thing is, let me address the first question, what are we telling them? We're basically telling them the truth. We're telling them the uncomfortable truth. And that's the thing I think what a lot of people need to realize is that everyone's talking about they label what we're doing as we're bad-mouthing the country, or we're putting the country's name in disrepute. But it's simply not the case. We're just telling the truth. And I would rather go to the world and tell them an uncomfortable truth.
Tell us that truth that you are telling the world. What is that truth that you're telling the world?
For example, I wish we had more time so I can give you everything, but I can give you a small amount. Firstly, for anyone that is curious in like the bigger picture and all the detail, we have the report that we are taking to the United States. It is out there, it's public. You can just Google AfriForum, the world must know, and you'll find it in a PDF. It's 20 pages and very detailed with over 200 sources. So the thing is, what we're telling them with this tour specifically, that's really the crux of it, is what's happening to minority rights in South Africa. So a good example is the Afrikaans linguistic community in South Africa. That is a linguistic minority. We're talking about how Afrikaans is being faceted out of education, and how, for example, even when AfriForum or Solidarity build an Afrikaans university, a private one out of our own funds, that not the taxpayers' funds, and nobody has to pay for it, we still have ANC politicians like Lessufi saying, no, you can't do that. And then we ask the question, but why? You say we are not welcome to be educated in our language in public universities. That's fine. We will go away. We will go over there in that little corner. We'll build with our own money and our own labor. We will build this university. And then you still come to us and say, you're not allowed.
I don't even want to get sidetracked there, but before I give you the final word, Professor Karungu, I still want to know, what sort of concessions are you willing to make to bring about a solution?
We are very open to dialogue with the ANC and the government. We, as we always say, we want to solve this domestically. Going abroad is not our first option. It really isn't the...
No, but what concessions are you willing to make? Are you willing to say, I'm willing to give so much of the land that I have? We are willing to negotiate here, and this is how much we're willing to give at this stage for so much. What are the concessions?
I don't think AfriForum can make that call where we say we are willing to give this percentage of our members' land to someone. We can only talk in terms of the bigger picture by taking on destructive economic policies, but I don't think we represent all the landowners in South Africa and will be able to make a concession like, for example, in the land debate where we say this amount we will give as a concession. I don't think we are in that position. We are a civil rights organization. We are an organization that fights for the civil rights of South Africans and for specifically our members. And the best we then can do is to speak out when we see destructive economic policies that have failed in other countries, and to really bring about the country that will really solve these problems, and that's one that follows sound economic policies rather than populist rhetoric or drastic policies that only think, as my colleague mentioned earlier, that focus on the short term and not on long-term solutions. We want solutions now, not later. That's not a sustainable way of looking at it.
And this is what the people are saying. We want the land now, not later. We want solutions now, not later as well. Professor Karungu, failed policies that bring us to the point where we are at right now.
First, let me just put one comment you made. You said clearly, you don't know the solution, you don't have the solution, but what you do know is the worst that can happen and the worst case scenario. That means, my fear, you hype fear, you create the worst case scenario and you don't have a solution. You talk of the failed state, Venezuela, but you don't have a solution to stop us from getting there. In economic, we ask a pragmatic question. I agree with you. You know the worst case scenario. You don't even have a clue what the AfriForum would negotiate with the farmers in lieu of the dire need we have to do. That's a bit worrying. That's a bit worrying. It's a question I would ask you, AfriForum. You said it, and please remember what I'm asking. Please don't hype the worst case scenario if you don't have a solution on what we are putting on the table. It's what we call a zero-sum game. Except the fear grows, and the American people believe in the fear, which doesn't exist because we have tried a solution. Now, the failed state...
1 minute.
1 minute. The failed state is an outcome, literally, in my view, of having tried so much and sometimes failing not to get the grip of the solution to solve the dire problem we are facing as a South African. However, it's also, in my view, and this is to the ANC, we need to start pumping brains in the government. We need to start not having in my view, and I say that to the president if I meet him, we can't have somebody who was the minister in 1994, is still the minister today, when we could have brought younger people, people who have the drive to accept change. Because somewhere, somehow, that's what leads to what we call a little bit of leniency, incompetence, and then people take advantage of the situation. To me, that's what we need to guard. However, let's not mix the two about corruption, failing of the government, and the economic reality that we face. The economic reality we face of unemployment has to be dealt with what needs to be done among us. And there is always a fear people don't understand. The government is not a solution to everything. It is supposed to create an environment for us to thrive. That's what you're asking for. That's what we want. But the same government doesn't have the power to address that which ought to cut down the helplessness in the country, because AfriForum is also saying, don't take land.
But
we need
that's a
land.
question. who is in charge?
Who is going to in
if
charge?
Government isn't able to do that, who is in charge?
Correct.
That, unfortunately, is where we're going to have to leave it. Economic consultant Dr. Peter Karungu and Ernst van Zyl, AfriForum's campaign manager, giving their perspectives. And, of course, this conversation triggered by comments that were made by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Addis Ababa that South Africa's plan to seize land would be a disaster for the economy and for the South African people. It's time for Headlines.